This is your Thursday Daily Delivery. I am Michael Rand. Shout out to everyone out there. Thanks for listening again today on this chilly Thursday. Hopefully this is one of the last sub-zero daily deliveries of 2022, but here we are right now. Lots to talk about, as we often do. Going to get to Chris Hine in just a little bit here. Timberwolves beat writer will join me, talk about the second half, or really, last 23 games post All-Star break for the Timberwolves, kind of what's at stake, what we should be watching for, and how we will ultimately define this season. Still, that story's still yet to unfold, but a lot can happen in these final 23 games to change or maintain perceptions after what I would consider a surprisingly good first 59 games of this season. They have overachieved relative to my expectations, at least, and I believe of external expectations as well. Got to get to another Aaron Rodgers nugget that apparently they never said they were going to trade him. That's what Packers GM Brian Gutekunst said recently. Interesting remarks there. Wonder how that will impact the relationship. Got to get to Troy Aikman nugget that I thought was interesting, and a Major League Baseball update as well. But first, what did I miss? Kind of the two big stories percolating in my mind and in Twin Cities media on Wednesday. One was Gophers Badgers basketball, men's basketball on Wednesday night, and the other was the kind of evolving controversy is the wrong word, but the dilemma the Wild is facing now with two goaltenders rotating time, more of an even split lately, and the reasons behind that and what that has meant for both goalies. Some interesting comments from Dean Evison, some stand-up comments from Cam Talbot on Wednesday that I want to play for you. But I want to get to the Gopher Badgers game first, if I could. An entertaining game largely on Wednesday. Gophers come up just short, 68-67. Now, it wasn't like a down to the last shot kind of game. Gophers made a three with about 1 second left to make that final score, look extra tight. But it was a close game, back and forth the whole way. Gophers made a lot of good plays. The first half, Jamison Battle was essentially unstoppable, going down the lane, dunking, making his long jump shots, things like that. And then, Wisconsin kind of clamped down on that a little bit, but that left other people open as well. So it was the game plan was a good one from the Gophers. You could see the talent deficit a lot of times, but they also were, throwing some different defensive looks at the Badgers, threw a zone at them in the first half that gave them some trouble, and really were able to hang with the team that is very good. Obviously, now this game was at Williams Arena, so you have the home court, you have the rival, you have some emotions there, and you could tell the emotions were flowing in that game in a positive way, maybe a little bit more positive than in the handshake line of Wisconsin's previous game. So while there are no moral victories, especially in, rivalry, border battle type games, you can kind of see the seeds that are being planted still with this Ben Johnson team. This group that he's taken of, largely mid-major transfers, guys who are probably only going to be here for 1 year aside from Jamison Battle, and, gotten them to play hard, gotten to install his systems, gotten to kind of show what he can do in terms of in-game adjustments, out-of-timeout plays, which I've been impressed with, things like that. So even though this year maybe hasn't had, certainly hasn't had the Big Ten finish that you had hoped for after that way better than expected non-conference season, you can still see the pieces falling into place here under Ben Johnson, and that's probably the biggest takeaway you're going to get from this season. One, that Ben Johnson looks like he can coach in multiple ways and has a good staff to help him with that as well. And two, that Jamison Battle, who's going to be here for a while longer still, looks like a player, looks like a guy who you want on this team. Maybe not a guy that on a great team has to carry you, but certainly a good piece on a good team. And if they can build some more around that as the years go on, they should be coming out on the winning end of this rivalry sooner rather than later. Let's hear a little bit from Jamison Battle, by the way, from that game, just kind of what he thought were just the kind of the reason they came up short and some motivation for the rest of this season.
We got to go out there and just make winning plays. I think we did that tonight, but I think there were a couple plays where we missed on those. Like EJ said, maybe it was a long rebound, maybe it was us not getting the stop. So I think it has to do with that. And I think in the end, these last 3-4 games, you're going to see us make those winning plays. I think that's just going to be a change in our head and a change in mentality. We're going to go out there and be the grittiest team on the block.
Let's transition now to the Wild. I don't want to belabor this point because I spent a good portion of the early part of Wednesday's show kind of talking about my thoughts on the goalie situation. I've been a big Kaapo Kähkönen guy for a while now, going back to 2-3 years ago when Dubnyk was struggling, and I was like, this guy down in the minors who looks like he's got pretty good numbers, maybe give him a chance. And finally, looks like Kähkönen is getting that chance more regularly this year. And look, there's certainly some recency bias coming into play here. But in this snapshot of time, right now as we speak, Kaapo Kähkönen, who's technically still a rookie, even though he played a fair amount last year, is outplaying Cam Talbot over the balance of this season. Talbot, the veteran. Kähkönen has a better goals against average. He has a better save percentage. He's got a better quality start percentage. Quality starts defined as a start where you have better than the league average save percentage, or at least a save percentage of 88.5 in a game where you face 20 shots or fewer. Kähkönen's delivered a quality start in like 70% of his starts. He's avoided the real meltdown games by and large this season. His record is better. I mean, he's not played as much as Talbot, but recently it has changed to the point that, Kähkönen has been the better goalie, I think, certainly lately, and, you can make the argument that he's been the better goalie over the balance of the season. Maybe some of his, maybe he doesn't get the bigger games. Maybe Talbot has played a heavier workload, so I think both of them have been effective during large stretches of the season, and they're going to need both of them over the course of the year, like we've talked about, because they have so many games coming up. But interesting that Dean Evason is going to more of a goalie rotation, but also interesting how much he defended Cam Talbot in his Wednesday availability, talking about how that game against Ottawa where they lost 4-3. He certainly would have loved to see Talbot make more saves, but especially on that first goal, had a very interesting quote. Here is Dean Evason talking about that.
It's certainly not on our goalie, on Cam, for sure. I mean, that first goal, maybe you could say, okay, but when a guy like Chabot walks right down the gut with absolutely nobody in front of him, that's not Cam's fault. That's somebody in our defensive zone coverage effed up, and you can go look at the tape to find out who, but it's a mistake we need to rectify. And yeah, sure, would we like the goaltenders to make a save when we mess up? Sure, but it doesn't always happen that way. So there's no question that we don't put it on our goaltender.
It feels like he was like one more question about goalies away from going full Jerry Burns rant there. That's not Schnelker's fault territory. That's not Cam's fault kind of stuff. And he also wanted us to go look at the tape of that play. I did go look at the tape of that play. Don't know exactly who's supposed to be where on every play, but from the naked eye, it looks like the problem in coverage was someone whose name rhymes with Shmevin Shmiala. Again, I don't know exactly who's supposed to be where, but he did not look like he was in the right place or having the right defensive zone responsibilities. Everybody was kind of chasing the puck, left someone just wide open to roll right down the middle of the ice and into that prime territory where he scored on Talbot. So, it's interesting to note kind of what Evason thinks about all this. It's also interesting to note what Cam Talbot thinks of all this. So let's hear from Cam Talbot as well.
It's always frustrating when, everyone's a competitor. You want the net. It's how I've been my entire career. And, when you're not playing, you can do one of two things. You can sit there and sulk, or you can go out there and work hard and be ready for your next start. So that's always been my mentality, and that's how I'm going to continue to approach things.
And on the subject of goalie rotation, Kaapo Kähkönen will get the start tonight against Toronto. And it's interesting because this was a little 2-game trip. If you're going to split the goalies, you really could have split them either way. Talbot played against the easier opponent. Let's face it, Ottawa's a much lesser team than Toronto is. Toronto, a quality team in the East, pretty much on par with the Wild, and that's the start that Kähkönen gets. So are we witnessing a changing of the guard a little bit, or is this just kind of one of those ebbs and flows in the course of a season? That is going to be the question to watch going forward. What to watch tonight, though, is Kaapo Kähkönen in the net, and if he has another good game tonight, this might go from a goaltender dilemma into a full-blown goalie controversy.
Take a playcation to Mystic Lake for 24/7 gaming, fun restaurants and bars, and luxurious hotel rooms. And join Club M to bask in the rewards. Follow the lights to Mystic Lake, where every day is play day.
I'd like to welcome back onto Daily Delivery Chris Hine, of course, covers the Timberwolves for the Star Tribune. Had a little bit of a break, although I don't know how much of downtime you got, Chris, but we're coming off the All-Star break. Wolves haven't played in about a week, but back at it Thursday night against Memphis. Some interesting games right out of the break. Maybe we can start kind of micro with Memphis and Philadelphia coming up right on the heels of that. That could be the debut of James Harden in Philadelphia. We'll see. But from your perspective, Chris, it's gonna be an interesting final 23 games, and then kind of a good early second half, second third measuring stick game against Memphis. A team that's overachieved, probably the only team that's overachieved more than Minnesota this year in terms of relative expectations based on what their preseason win totals might have looked like.
Yeah, I'd throw Cleveland into that mix as well, but definitely the Wolves and Memphis are in that mix. I think I love these matchups with the Wolves and Memphis. The Wolves blew them out once this year. The two games in Memphis were really good, really competitive games. It's always fun to see John Morant in person. He reminds me of like pre-ACL tear Derrick Rose in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And along those lines, I worry about John Morant, and his health long term because of that, because he can play so violently at times with the way he moves. But it's a joy to watch him play. They've been good matchups. Memphis is a fun team to watch, and yeah, these two games are about as good as it gets for a home back to back here.
And it could be, Memphis, for as good as Memphis is, this does seem like a decent matchup for the Wolves based on just, their personnel and based on what we've seen for the three games this season, even going back a little further than that. This, and this has the potential to, if things break a certain way, if they break in the Wolves' favor, which would probably mean them getting up to that number 6 seed, which is a tall ask, but not out of the question. This is a potential playoff matchup if they wind up as the number 6 and the number 3 seeds in the West, respectively. But maybe we can start with the idea of, is that 6 seed really realistic?
It's within reach, but if I was betting, I would bet against it happening. And not just because the Wolves are starting behind in the standings with 23 games left here. To me, the Wolves, I just don't think they've quite graduated to that class of team ahead of them, like Denver with Jokic, who just refuses to let Denver slip past a certain point, and Dallas with Luka. Like Dallas before the break had a win against Miami that it looked like it would probably be a loss on paper, but Dallas goes into Miami and pulls it out. Meanwhile, the Wolves are at home against Toronto, and Fred VanVleet is out for Toronto, and the Wolves can't come up with a win in that game at home. That to me is a bit of a snapshot of where the Wolves are relative to these teams that are ahead of them. I just don't think they have quite what it takes to pass one of these teams that's ahead of them right now. There's been a lot of good things right now with this team, and they've done a lot of good things, but that right there was a bit of a snapshot and a bit of a tell to me. And Patrick Beverley even said so after the game, that loss really seemed to bother him. So they got to clean up issues like that and win games like that if you want to be a top 6 team, top 5 team, you gotta have those games.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That Toronto game felt like that to me as well at the time. And I know that they had come off a game against Charlotte where they kind of pulled a victory out of the jaws of defeat. And, so that was a good example of finding some resolve, but you got to do it every night, or at least close to every night. And I think that consistency piece, or that kind of, willing to kind of grind through a game, Toronto, even without Van Vliet's got some skill, but they are always going to play tough. They're going to play smart, and a team like that can frustrate you and wear you down. And that was a game that was a kind of a grinding game that you're going to experience in these last 23, I would imagine, especially against teams that are in playoff contention.
Yeah. And as with any part of the schedule goes in ebbs and flows after this tough stretch here next week, especially later in the week when they play Oklahoma City and then Portland. You got some winnable games on the schedule there. But yeah, that's what we mean. It's like you need to be consistent in these kind of games. You need to win those grind out games at home when you might not be feeling 100%. That's what it takes to be a playoff team and a top tier team in the NBA, and not just be content with getting the 7 or the 8 seed or wherever the Wolves may end up finishing this season.
And that kind of, brings me to this, we've acknowledged that the 6 is in play if they have a good final 23 games, and maybe one of those other teams, falters a little bit. But, if they wind up as the 7 or the 8, which I think are probably the two most likely scenarios, they're going to have, they're almost hurt by the 1 through 10 this year, because they're going to have to play probably the Lakers or the Clippers in the play-in round. I mean, that's no picnic right there. I mean, those are not the teams you would want to see in the 9 or 10 spot, or, whoever they're going to face, in those potentially 1 or 2 games to actually get into the top 8 in the actual playoff round.
Yeah. If I was to handicap it, I would say that if the season were to, if I was to predict the end of the season, the Wolves and the Clippers would probably be playing each other in the 7-8 game in some fashion. That would be my prediction there. And then the loser of that ends up playing the Lakers for that final playoff spot I think the Lakers probably end up in that 9 slot. And they beat whoever ends up in 10, whether it's Portland or New Orleans. And then they play the loser of the Clippers and Wolves. And, if the Clippers were to get Paul George back, that team beat the Wolves 3 times this season when Paul George was playing. The Lakers have one of the greatest basketball players of all time in a 1-game scenario against you. So, even though you'd have 2 cracks at it in that sense, it's still a very precarious position to be in to if you only get the 7 seed or the 8 seed. So there's real incentive for them to get up to that 6 seed, because you want to avoid those 1-game scenarios as much as possible, for sure.
To that end, that we are talking about possible playoff scenarios is a difference from most of the last 15 to 17 years. Not talking about the lottery at this time of year. We're talking about, can they secure this kind of seed or that kind of seed? And a lot of that has to do, with the fact that I think they've overachieved a little bit to get to this point, but I'd be curious to know, like, relative to expectations you had coming into the season, is 31-28 at the All-Star break better than you thought they would be?
Maybe a little better. I predicted them to be a play-in team before the season started. I predicted them to get the 10 seed. That's where I had them finishing. So they have exceeded my expectations if they end up in the 7-8 range here. I think it's interesting. So let's play it out here. If they get to the play-in and they don't make the playoffs, do you consider that a success? Like if they flame out in the play-in round?
I don't know if I consider it a success. I would still consider it a step forward. How about that? It would feel like you left something on the table, especially if you were a 7 or 8 and had 2 cracks at it and couldn't get it done. I mean, you would learn something regardless. It would be much better than it's been for almost any other season in recent memory. So it would be progress. I don't know if you would call it success. I think you would call it what you set out to do this season at the start, and maybe we've adjusted our expectations, I think, because they've been maybe better than I thought they'd be by, a few games. And, the West has been a little bit worse overall than I thought it would be. So we've probably recalibrated to the point where we think getting into that top 8 now feels like what would be success to me.
Yeah, I think a successful season is an actual playoff appearance to me. I think I definitely think it would feel like a bit of a letdown if they make the play-in and then don't actually play a first round playoff series. I think that's where we're at right now. I think before the season, the goal was, just get in the play-in mix and see what happens. Now I think this team is good enough and has the potential to get into a first round playoff series, and we'll see what the matchup is and whatnot from there. But I do think the expectations and the disappointment would have changed just given what we've seen from this team this season.
I think that's true, and I think the players are, largely the ones that are fueling this. We've seen steps forward, I think, this year for sure from Karl Anthony Towns. We've seen D'Angelo Russell have an impact beyond maybe what we imagined, or maybe what, about in line with what they hoped, I guess. But, a large part of the credit, I think, this year has to go to head coach Chris Finch. And I believe he's right around the 1-year anniversary of when he started in the middle of last season right now. And, they've had a much greater measure of success and more stability also with him in charge. What, as you think about his first year, what have we learned about Chris Finch, the head coach, and the success he's had so far?
One of the biggest things I think you hear a lot of from players is he holds everybody accountable. He's not afraid to hold everybody accountable. And that means whether it's Towns or Edwards or Russell to the guys towards the end of the bench. It's, but at the same time, he's not some, taskmaster that doesn't, only cares about basketball or only, is only there to scream and holler and yell. He walks kind of both lines of positive reinforcement and getting on guys when he has to. So I think he's done a good job of balancing that. In that way, players know that you're not just there to scream and holler, and that you actually do care about them as people on the court, off the court. He's been direct and honest with players. We've heard that from people like Jalen Noel, Taurean Prince, and Patrick Beverly in terms of how good of a communicator he's been. So I think those are the big things that we've learned, is just his demeanor, his approach. He's a very even-keeled guy. He doesn't get too high or too low. He takes losses hard, just like anybody does. But he doesn't seem to let that affect, roll over from one day to the next, which is important in the NBA. And the team, I think, as a whole, kind of takes the lead from that.
The only gripe I have with the kind of what he's maybe done this year is, for as good as the defense seemed to be in the first, 6 weeks, actually really the whole, calendar year 2021, it seems like they've changed some things on defense. And Dane Moore and I got into this a little bit on the podcast last week, just kind of talking about maybe you need to be a little bit more multiple when you get to the playoffs. You're kind of thinking forward, but it seemed like they had a style that was working, this kind of scrambling, chasing guys off the line. Everybody's just kind of, going 100% all the time and, chasing the guy with the ball and making life hard. Maybe that's not sustainable, but it seemed like it was working and that they've gone away from that. Why? Explain that to me if you can.
Yeah, it really is with an eye towards a postseason, right? It is that is the explanation, is trying to just vary your coverages, vary the looks, confuse the offense, be able to go back and forth, not just with a singular game plan, but within a game itself. When you want to switch up styles, whether you're playing more of a high wall, or maybe you want to go more into a drop coverage against certain matchups. So I think it's just that versatility of being able to adapt on the fly, trying to make yourself a tougher opponent to match up with when you can play multiple defensive coverages, because in a playoff series, teams always counter, coaches make adjustments, and if you're just kind of stuck playing the same defensive system, they're going to scheme around it and figure you out eventually. And it's starting to try to lay the groundwork, not just for now, but also for maybe past this season, where some of these guys are getting some of this knowledge now, getting it into their DNA, so that maybe next season they hit the ground running with some of this stuff.
I get that. I also think there's years of evidence suggesting that they're not good at drop coverage, and
yes,
that they shouldn't do it because they're not good at it.
No, there's plenty of bottom third defensive ratings in the last few years to let you know just how bad the drop coverage has worked out for them. But that's why you just try to deploy it against certain matchups where you think it might actually work, as opposed to just having one thing be your main thing and that's it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Final thought for you: what beyond just outcomes, what are you looking to see in these final 23 games? What are some of the most important things you want to see from this team, whether it's individually or as a collective?
One of the things that I'm going to be really intrigued by, especially as the season tightens up, the games really start to matter more for seeding purposes, and then obviously into the play-in or playoffs, is just how does Anthony Edwards respond to this? Because we see all the time, you saw it with Cat in the Houston playoff series a few years back. Sometimes young stars in their first kind of taste of games really mattering, teams game plan for them differently, or do things to slow them down, and how do they adjust to that? And I think this is going to be Edwards's first real test of, and for some of these guys on the team as well, of basketball that really matters, and how do they respond to that? How do they up their games, adjust their games, counter what teams are trying to do to them? As we've seen throughout the season, teams have paid more and more attention to Edwards, and there have been nights he struggled with it. There are nights he struggled with different defensive coverages. He's tried to play through some injuries as well. But he's not immune to throwing up a clunker here and there. And so how does he respond during these kind of pressure situations? I think he's very confident. He's built for it. It's just for this year, how is he going to handle that?
Yeah, that's one of the bigger ones I'm watching too, because it does feel like I don't know if he hit a little bit of a wall or just had a kind of a stretch of games where they were kind of meh. There was the really good one sprinkled in there in the midst of all of them, but certainly have seen better stretches from Anthony Edwards. Maybe a week of not playing at least NBA games will kind of recharge him, but that is certainly a big one coming out of the break, because they, as good as Cat's been this year, they need Anthony Edwards if this is going to go anywhere at any point.
Absolutely. And that's one reason why you want to at least try to get into a playoff series here, is get these guys that experience, because there's nothing like that experience that you can replicate. Absolutely.
Well, there'll be, some good early tests. Like we said, Memphis and Philadelphia right out of the chute, two teams that have, some intrigue in general. We'll be watching those and following Chris Hine's coverage, Star Tribune, StarTribune.com. Chris, always a pleasure. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much, Mike.
And as Chris alluded to, interesting schedule for the Wolves coming out of the break. Not easy at all in their first four, against the Grizzlies, against the 76ers, and those are back-to-backs. Then it will go into play the surprising Cavaliers, then hosting Golden State. The next night after that, also a back-to-back. But then the next five after that game, Thunder, Blazers, Thunder, Magic, a chance to get well again. So these first four will be a good kind of litmus test to what kind of second half this is going to be. So this is going to be a nice story where they kind of plop into one of those play-in spots, or can they make a real run at that number 6 seed? I think we'll get some answers pretty quick here, and it should be fun. Like I told Chris, fun to talk about playoff basketball and not ping pong balls for a change. Let's do a rapid fire cooler with 3 different subjects really quick that I wanted to get to. One, Troy Aikman sounds like he is going to leave Fox and head to Monday Night Football to be the lead analyst at ESPN. Interesting move there. That report coming from the New York Post. So that would be a pretty big shakeup in an already kind of twisty, turny broadcast situation that's happening right now with Al Michaels being out at NBC and kind of going from there with a lot of different names perhaps moving around. So that one is that's an interesting one to be sure to watch for. That's a pretty big move, one of the top guys in this game. So watch for that next year. Major League Baseball has set a deadline of Monday. If there's no deal done by Monday, they are saying that there will be regular season games missed. Now, you can always move that target. You can always shift things, and that's probably a negotiation ploy. But we're getting into the territory now with these negotiations between the players and the owners that's not just spring training, or it's not just a hypothetical anymore. We're getting into the territory where if they don't get closer together soon, you are going to miss games this year. That's lost revenue for players. That's bad news for fans. Things like that. After 2 seasons where there was all sorts of interruptions, pauses, strangeness, things like that, especially 2020, that would be an awful look for baseball. So hopefully they can figure that out sooner rather than later. And finally, interesting quote coming out of Green Bay regarding Aaron Rodgers. And I don't mean to keep making this the Aaron Rodgers podcast, but Brian Gutekunst, their general manager, addressed the media on Wednesday. Was asked if there was an agreement that they would trade Rodgers if he wanted to be traded after the 2021 season. Gutekunst said that was not something I told him. And Gutekunst obviously has full control over the roster. Again, I think the whole conversation with Aaron last season before he came back was that regardless, at the end of this past season, that we would sit down as a group, we would work it out one way or another. It's interesting because all along we have operated under the assumption that Rodgers kind of has an agreement that if he doesn't want to be there, they will facilitate a trade. And maybe facilitate is less than a promise, but interesting if this is kind of part of the back and forth here. Rodgers, of course, supposed to decide soon if he wants to return to Green Bay for another season or if he would like to do something else. So just another wrinkle in that story and an interesting one at that. That will do it for today's Daily Delivery. Thank you so much for listening. Adrian Heath, Minnesota United manager, will be on Friday's show to help me set up the 2022 season, which begins for the Loons on Saturday in Philadelphia. Great stuff, as always, from Adrian Heath. Thanks again for joining me here today. I'll be back at it again on Friday.